Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Chief Value Officer, adding value through communication. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time out of your day to attend and listen to us discuss this important topic. We'll just run through a bit of housekeeping and other things. So starting off, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And we extend our respect to Torres Strait, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. So questions can be submitted through the questions tab on the right-hand side or in the tab there. Any technical difficulties you're experiencing, please click support or visit the site there. And then from a follow-up perspective, after the webinar, we're going to send you an email containing the presentation slides that we do today, a link to the recording of the webinar, access to other webinars in the series, and our contact details as well. Also, I note that we will attempt to answer any unanswered questions in this series as well if we do miss out on answering any questions that you put through. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. So myself, Nick Fox, partner at BDO here in the CFO Advisory Division. I've been on the panels working with the Chief Value Officer concept and really pushing this forward. Andrew Butler is joining us. I'll let Andrew quickly introduce himself from Wilkinson Butler.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Mr. Fox. Delighted to be here. It's a very enthralling conversation ahead of us. So Wilkinson Butler, we're a strategic communications firm where we're squarely focused on building trust, on building and protecting reputation and social license, and also around influencing change. We're known in the marketplace as very much experts in issues of crisis management. We deal with a lot of burning issues, particularly in the media. But we're also heavily focused on sustainability. We've got a lot of clients in the clean energy space, which is always a delight to work in. We're assisting in the energy transition. And also have a rapidly growing digital presence. So we're dealing with every day, we're dealing with media, we're dealing with government, we deal a lot directly with consumers and communities, and a range of other key stakeholders. And I'm also recently hired a role, an accountant-heavy general manager who would fit the bill of a chief value officer very, very well.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And then you have been talking about your Chief Value Officer a fair bit recently, so it's good to hear that's
banging on about it, will I?
And also, Sue Rosen. Sue, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Andrew. It's great to be here with you both. And good morning to all the attendees. It's great to be here talking about this topic, which is one that I'm very passionate about. So I'm Sue Rosen. I'm an executive coach and leadership development facilitator, working primarily with CFOs and their teams to help take their performance up to the next level. I partner with my clients because leadership is tough, right? And together we work together to help leaders feel more authentic and more fulfilled in their work, whilst also enhancing their executive presence and improving the leadership impact that they have so that you can really make the contribution that you want to make. Prior to moving into this space, the coaching and leadership space, I started my career as a chartered accountant back in London, then moved to Sydney and led finance teams across a range of industries for many years before finally landing as a CFO in a small private equity funds manager before taking this, which is pretty big career shift. But I love working, I love working with people in the finance space because that was my experience. And so I'm often trying to support people in the way that I wish I had been supported when I was a finance leader or either emerging leader or even in that CFO role. So yeah, delighted to be here this morning.
So an ex-Chief Value Officer, actually no, much more than that, a current Chief Value Officer, 2 Chief Value Officers. Look, I might, I'll stop sharing my screen and jump into our first question for the panel, for both of you, in terms of why is it so important for CFOs and finance professionals to be good communicators, noting that traditionally accountants are not known to be great communicators. And in terms of this, I'd like to quickly talk about, I reached out to Sue because I was at a conference recently where a lot of CFOs were getting up and talking, and everyone talked in a monotone, pretty much exactly the same as I am currently talking. And Sue got up and talked, and it was completely different and refreshing to hear someone actually have inflection in their tones and have a different way of talking and communicating. So it was, I think it's really powerful to be able to do that. And sorry, Sue, to throw you under the bus here in certain ways, but I think it's really important that communication is so important what we do. And as accounting professionals, we're not particularly known to be great communicators. So Sue, would you like to talk about your experience and how communication really adds value from your perspective and with the people you work with?
Thank you, Nick, and thank you. That's a lovely compliment as well. But you're right. Now I'm really under the pump to, okay, I've got to deliver now in terms of how I present today. Look, I really believe communication is absolutely critical for finance leaders, because finance leaders are perfectly positioned within organizations to be change agents, and change is really hard, and to be able to communicate and bring people along on any journey of change requires communication. It requires relationship building. I think relationship building and communication go hand in hand. And those are absolutely critical to finance leaders. And finance leaders are well positioned because they have oversight across so much of the business. They have access to so much of the data, so that any digital transformation or indeed any systems change or strategic decision making, their insights and their expertise are critical. But if you're just working on that stuff on a laptop away in a back office, it doesn't make these things happen. So to be effective, you need to be able to sell the story of why change is important, share the vision of what you want, and reassure people about how it's going to affect them. You need to be able to inspire and empower. You need to be able to influence. And to do that, you have to establish your own credibility and you have to build trust. And those things absolutely mean you need to be communicating with people in all different ways. But those things cannot happen without communication. And I would also actually, just as an add-on to that, is that for your own career development as well, you know, to each individual on this webinar now, from the perspective of your own career development, I see finance professionals too often focus on what I call the 3 fallacies of career success, which are around being technically brilliant, working hard, and having loads of willingness to get stuff done. Those are sadly not enough to get you promoted and moving up into senior levels of leadership, and having that kind of, you know, making the contribution you want and having the impact you want. You've got to be visible. You've got to be connecting to stakeholders. And to do that, communication is key. So yeah, I think absolutely imperative that we shift away from this purely task and technical expertise focus into a much broader focus as finance leaders. Absolutely. I'll hand over to you, Andrew, why you think it's important.
Yeah, Andrew.
I think that's very elegantly put, Sue. I love the point about the CVO is perfectly placed to be an agent of change. I think I couldn't be more in agreement around that. I think for me, it's and just springboarding. There's a lot of repetition here, and I'm sure we'll get to a point where we disagree at some point soon. But I think three points for me is really. I think good communications are a general leadership skill. That to be a leader, you really need to be a good communicator, to bring teams, to bring organisations, to bring external stakeholders along the journey with you, and to reiterate Sue's point, to really sell the story. And another thing, particularly for people, CFOs and leaders in the financial space, is and I'm going to be a little critical of other people in the C-suite even, and perhaps even sometimes at board level. You'd be surprised at how poor the average person's financial literacy is. So there's a particular onus on the CFO or the CVO in terms of communicating the complexity of financial data and to really cut through, I guess, go beyond the two dimensions of financial data and really to be communicating it and again, borrowing from Sue, the story behind the figures. And that's not always an easy thing to do. I think thirdly, and again, something that Sue mentioned is the idea of trust. Is because you have that gap in financial literacy, it's almost like going to a surgeon. You're putting your trust in the surgeon. It's like, right, okay, well, I certainly can't do it myself, and Uncle Bob's not going to do it for me, so it's in your hands. That sense of, okay, I trust that you understand the figures, I trust that you know what you're doing, but communication underpins building that trust, building that gravitas, and being able to cut through that complexity and communicating that complexity to a group of people who's often their financial literacy isn't very, it's not up to the same standard. And they're not necessarily in admission of that flaw. Time after time, I get often at CEOs that come to us in the time of a crisis, and where an issue intersects financial data, I'm surprised at how often I'll have a room full of C-suite people and they won't be able to tell the underlying financial story that underpins the problem that's about to blow up in the media, for instance. So I think it's really those three issues for me. It's the communications, essential to leadership skills, essential for you in terms of communicating financial literacy and empowering others and building trust.
That's a really good point, and thank you both. That's really insightful. I think some of the things that I got out of that were effectively accountants and finance professionals. We're known for being quite technically proficient, but also there is that communication element of just saying, so what? Here's the P&L, here's the balance sheet. So what? What does that actually mean for the business? What does that mean? And I was once told, and I thought this was a really good piece of communication advice, is I'm not only responsible for message sent, I'm also responsible for message received. So when I talk to my stakeholders within an organization, I need to actually make sure that they understand what I'm talking about. So where I find that as a chartered accountant, we can get caught up in is basically starting to talk with technical jargon and not really distilling down the information they need and talking about what's actually relevant, and also simplifying the language. Because a lot of business owners, and Andrew and Sue probably will agree with me here, is they don't want to be seen as dumb. So they just might nod along and agree. Yep.
So true.
Yeah.
Can I add something to that, to Nick, as well, please? There's two pieces there and I love that, Andrew, the financial literacy piece. It's, staying away from the jargon that every team, whether it's IT or finance or marketing or sales, every team has their own jargon. But we need to be able to communicate without that, as you say, simplifying the language, taking it back to what my audience understands. Where is my audience? And, that can be part of the undertaking of a finance team, is actually to educate the C-suite and bring their understanding, their financial literacy to a higher level. But in the first instance, working with where they're at. And I think the second piece there around communication that sometimes gets lost, and it talks exactly to what you're saying there, Nick, about, message sent. We send what we think says the message. Listening is a really critical part of communication. This is not one way. If we are not able to listen and understand the perspectives of our audience, we won't be able to tailor the message in a way that will land with them. And then there is, of course, the follow-up to ensure understanding and clarification. But I think, if we take it back a step, it's not just saying, well, I gave them all the information. Because, accountants are also known, and I've been there, I've done this myself, and I see it with clients. They've done all this detailed work. So they want to communicate, look at all this stuff I did. in order to get to the answer or the recommendation. And most of their stakeholders want 3 distilled bullet points. So, you know, there's a piece there about, I just think listening is so underrated and it's a critical part of communication, and distilling down your message so that the other person can hear it. And the onus for that is on us.
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah, and the tactical execution of how you communicate is often also an important choice. Not to drop my own poor C-suite in it without them being here to defend themselves, but so we present quite a detailed financial management report every month, and I've been conscious, oh goodness, some of my managing director report overlaps with that a bit, but I represent a lot of the data in the finance report with big pretty graphs, and they go from eyes glazed over of, oh yes, it's taken as read, just the big finance report, and they get to the pretty graphs and they're like, right, okay, yes, it's making sense to me, and the realization that, okay, yes, I'm doubling up, but I'm actually communicating in a way that's effective to them. Hence, I've left it in there and helping to improve their own financial literacy. Sorry, Tim.
That's actually really good in terms of, you've touched on another point, and Sue, you also talked about it. Another element is, a lot of the time we think about communication as me just talking right now, but Sue made a really good point of listen. Listen is a huge part of communication. And then Andrew also has just now talked about another point of communication, which is the non-verbal communication. What are we presenting to people? If I walk into a boardroom and I pull up a spreadsheet, which all accountants we love, with rows and rows of data, the board may just sit there and, as you said, their eyes glaze over. But if we graphically represent that and we communicate in the style that they're used to as well. So I think that's a really, really good point. I might just quickly jump on to now, you know, given that we've discussed what this looks like, what is the opportunity here for finance professionals in utilising communication to become more of a chief value officer? I think we've touched on all these points, but now let's distill it down. How will communication help us to actually take this opportunity and run forward? So Sue, you touched upon it before in terms of, if you want to become a leader, you need to be a really good communicator. In your coaching, this must be a cornerstone of what you
do. Yeah, so at a very high level, you know, my first response to this piece about the chief value officer is that it is only when you fully express yourself and you can articulate what you bring to the table and how you can contribute more meaningfully, that and that means communicating, and that's what's going to take you into all of these other areas of the CFO/CVO role, you know, this overlap, moving us away from the strictly looking backwards financial reporting piece. And that's essentially working on your executive presence, because that's what will get you noticed. I define executive presence as being the ability to inspire the confidence of others in your capabilities and your potential, even when under pressure. So, and communication is an essential part of that. But where you start with it, from my perspective, in terms of becoming the chief value officer, is you actually start, and I think all leadership actually has to start with some inward looking work. This is the self-reflection on, who am I? What are my values? What are my strengths? How do I articulate all of those? And coupling those with a growth mindset that's, you know, I'm going to continue learning and developing. So taking myself out of my finance team, most finance professionals I work with, you know, they're already doing some really great work within their own team. But this chief value officer piece is, how do I spend more time with the COO or the CMO or the CPO or the, you know, CSO or the CTO, or all of those people, building the relationships, understanding all of the different aspects of the organization. And there was actually, I just wanted, because there was I want to quote from your report, because there was a line that caught my eye, many, but just one in particular. The people of the organization working together with the other capitals, create the organization's commercial advantage. So how you work with people is really important, you know, and I think that's how you work with all levels of people. So it's how you demonstrate compassion for the people working at lower levels. It's how you influence your peers around strategic decision making. It's how you empower people to do great work, or reassure anxious board members, or inspire investors. So, you know, I really don't like the term human capital because it sounds way too like a finance and accounting term. They're people. They're real human beings with real human fears and desires. And, you know, for me, becoming the Chief Value Officer means being able to connect at so many different levels and understanding, you know, the COO, if he's got some real operational issues, and a lot of CFOs I work with actually are in that crossover CFO COO role. And how do I understand what's really important to him, or my Chief Marketing Officer? How do I understand what's really important to them? Because we are I think it's a term in the report as well, super connector. And that means not just super connector with the data, which might be a little bit more our comfort zone, but the super connector with the people, the ability to bring all the ideas from different parts of the organization together. And actually, as well, which is one I'm there as well. And key to that as well is this relationship with the CEO. But perhaps we'll build on that in a minute, because I just think I don't really believe that any organization is highly successful unless your CEO and CFO are working together well.
Yeah. I think we will jump down that rabbit hole. Andrew, do you have anything to add there?
I think just springboarding off a concept that Sue raised around the challenge of being inward looking, to sort of start with challenging ourselves to step up to the role or the opportunity that a Chief Value Officer presents. And I think it is going back to Sue's earlier point around that technical proficiency and the way in which typically finance people really embrace that. It is part of their identity. Unlike 80% of the world who say I was bad at maths, and they're not maths people. Most accountants, they were the people that were good at maths. It's part of their identity, and so and distilling and synthesizing complexity is again part of their complexity, part of their identity. So I think I kind of relate it to being a translator, and that traditional role is simply a translation of the financial data and other data points, and but we need to really go beyond that and make the numbers meaningful. And so if we extend that analogy, we think about the UN. Translators are a dime a dozen. They literally cycle through them every 20 minutes because of the high executive function required for a translator to be doing that exercise of thinking in two languages and translating from one to another and vice versa. But what you want to be is not the translator, not just the technical proficient person. You want to be the person who's either sitting behind the plaque representing your country or your organization, or at very least whispering in the ear of the person who is. And that's taking you from a very tactical role to a much more strategic, much more influential, and much more at the leading edge of, again, Sue's point, of change and really that opportunity. But to do that, you really, again, addressing that financial literacy element, you need to find a way to be compelling, to be persuasive, and crucially, to be succinct, to really tell the story behind the numbers and where the data is telling an organisation to go.
No, that's really useful to understand that. We've had a really good question come through on this in this vein. I'll just read it out. So curious to get panel's thoughts on it. Acquiring the skills to be a Chief Value Officer. As accountants, we are trained, not educated. As CVO skills comes from an education perspective. To step back and take on this skill for an established accountant is confronting to their core. How then do we influence institutions to educate rather than train graduates? Now, I think that's a really, really interesting set of questions there in terms of yes, we are trained. We're trained in debits and credits, etc. There's a lot of people, I would say, could do that. But I think this communication piece, in terms of if we want to talk about the graduate training, etc., I think we're learning a lot more about that, and I'll throw it to the panel shortly, but we're learning a lot more about that post-COVID. During COVID, I really felt for the graduates coming through, because they weren't able to sit within, in our organisations, professional services at least, I wasn't able to just bring them out to a client meeting, or I wasn't able to just have them sit next to me and ask the silly questions that you need to ask as a junior. I mean, I still ask silly questions all the time. So I think what we need to do is actually redefine how do we actually bring these people along. And I think there's an element of actually working together and actually showing that communication style. Sue, do you have any thoughts on this? It's a really interesting and broad topic.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I love actually the acknowledgement and the vulnerability in there as well, about saying that taking on this skill of a CBO and all of that goes with that is confronting to the core, as this person describes, which I think is really interesting. And it is absolutely what I see, because I see that we, and I know this was my own experience, as well. Now, my training was quite a long time ago, but it is this training, and we have been as we rise through our finance career, we are respected, well regarded, and rewarded for having the right answer so often in terms of the accounting sense. Now, obviously, there are areas in accounting and annual reports, financial statements, all of those things, tax, all of those things that are open for interpretation. But we are so used to being respected and regarded for having the right answer that I think the challenge with communication and with leadership more generally is that there isn't such a thing as a right answer. And oftentimes, sometimes maybe, but the complexity within which we work now is much greater, and the speed at which we work, I think, is much greater. And that requires us to be more adaptable and more flexible. And if we're still hanging on to this idea that I'm the boss or the leader and I have to have the right answer, it makes it even more challenging to us to let go of that, to really adopt this beginner's mindset and a growth mindset where we can ask questions. And as you said, you still ask the silly questions. And we go back to that thing that we have to go, well, there is no such silly question, because no such thing. Because if really you're coming at a problem or a challenge from a different perspective, you'll be asking different kinds of questions to the other people in the room, and that's valuable. So I feel like I've probably gone off on a tangent there, but so I do understand that it is confronting, and I think it's something that finance leaders absolutely have to address and work on, and it is part of the development. And from my own perspective, I would like to see, to the last part of the question, how do we influence institutions to educate rather than train graduates? I have to be honest and say I'm not close enough to, new grad training by either CPA or CA anymore to really know. But I do believe that those organisations, those associations really do need to be changing how they educate, because it's no longer enough to just have this technical expertise, especially with the introduction of more technology and automation that is taking away some of the work that some of us stepped into doing when we were new grads, and that work isn't there. So how do we upskill an accounting grad or a commerce grad into these other skills that we're looking at? And I think, Nick, to your point, a lot of that is by being around the people who are already doing the more senior level roles. It's about, but then I think there is a role for specific education. And maybe, this also, we're struggling to attract enough people, enough graduates into accounting and finance as an industry. And I think a shift in our focus around building these business and leadership skills actually could help us be a much more attractive proposition.
I agree. And sorry, Andrew, before you jump in there, I was just going to say one of the things that I've noticed recently is I said I still ask the silly questions. Well, I've only just started asking the silly questions because I've grown up and matured enough to understand that they aren't silly questions anymore. And so I think that's part of the point is you know, we're going through this one element, and this, Andrew, you might talk about this, so I don't want to steal your thunder, but effectively I've seen and talking to you as well from the crisis perspective is also the planning as well, understanding what you're going to say and thinking it through and going through those processes of actually thinking about how I'm going to approach different subjects, and particularly that one where Sue mentioned, oh, sorry, I don't have that, I'll come back to you with the answer. Those kind of questions. So when I know that you guys, Andrew, engage people, you also talk about plans. How are we going to respond to this crisis when it happens or if it happens? Sorry, I might let you talk more to that.
Well, some really interesting points coming out here, and this is again hitting on one of the key opportunities for a chief value officer is around the management of risk. So a lot of what we do is not just digging clients out of active crises, whether it's unfolding in the media or in government halls of power. It is often about, okay, how do we prepare for this, and how do we front foot a potential issue? And so yes, we do a lot of preparation. In fact, we even go through crisis scenarios and practice how they might present to the media. And yes, it distills down into, okay, what would be our key messages in this scenario, and also what would be the company's key message. And one thing that really cuts through, and this is talking about those really strong interpersonal skills, what we find in terms of when we do present to media, one thing that really cuts through is what's my personal message. And that is actually where you get, you know, as a spokesperson, potentially a CFO, but more likely a CEO, a real connection with their audiences. I'm personally devastated by this event. You know, I knew this person well, if it was a workplace injury, for instance. So yes, we do a lot of practice around that, and perhaps we can touch that on later around the importance of preparing your messages and how you communicate and thinking about it. Just touching on that skills piece, I think there's probably a role for our the peak bodies, your CPAs and CAs of the world, to actually be communicating to university bodies. Because ironically, our regular education system, primary and secondary, communications and that public speaking piece, for instance, and that persuasion, that has become a huge part of the education curriculum. And I'd be disappointed to hear that that's sort of lagging once they hit a tertiary education platform. But certainly there may be a role for those peak bodies. But in terms of mid-career, if you're kind of, you know, you're 10 or 15 years into your career, I did the AICD course. That is a very interesting way of challenging individuals and thinking about how to approach issues strategically. And that's where I think the CVO role is really around that board mentality of strategy and risk, and really thinking about that big picture. And if someone's thinking about, well, what do I do to improve my space and respond to the challenge of a CVO, I think the AICD course is a good place to really begin that journey, and communication underpins all of that.
That's
a
really
great
point.
example, Andrew. And yeah, we might build on it some more, but actually what you're saying there as well, Andrew, about preparing for crisis, I actually think that same principle and approach really works for us as well, in terms of not even just in crisis, but any important communication, whether it's perhaps for a board meeting or investor updates. The more you can prepare yourself, which again comes back to the preparing yourself mentally, physically, emotionally, all of those things to be in that space, but also actually preparing what the scenarios are. What are the objections that I anticipate, or the hard questions, and actually working through that with with somebody else in your finance team to say, or another peer on the leadership team. I think, practicing putting ourselves under pressure allows us to build that resilience, so that when somebody throws a different question, even the one that we didn't anticipate, psychologically we're more able to adapt to it in the moment.
That's really good. I like that one, and that preparation is really key. And I might throw another piece in there. When in our last webinar we talked about Gen AI, and you can actually ask ChatGPT, I'm going to go and meet the board. What will the board say to me? What will they ask those questions? Because I said this last time as well, we've all been there in the situation where you're sitting down in one of these high-powered meetings and someone asks you a question that potentially you feel like you should know the answer to, but you probably don't. And you have two choices. It's your sliding doors moment. You can try and wing it and hopefully no one actually notices, or the actual appropriate answer is, hey, I'm going to take that on notice. I don't have the answer right now. I'm going to get back to you. And that's a level of maturity that really helps with these conversations and that communication. And further to that, if you're asking ChatGPT or a colleague or a peer, they will come back to you and they may ask that question first in a safe environment as opposed to a high stakes board meeting. And therefore you can go and prepare. Now, you're not going to get 100% of the questions. Some of them may be completely left field, and some of them may be, I think we've all been there with a really odd board member who's asked a really odd question. But they're a board member and you've got to answer it. So we've got to do that. In terms of this, now we've got another question that's come through, but it's really, it comes into this place quite well. It says, I'm fully aligned and embrace the CBO themes discussed this morning. My experience is that being a CBO is also more rewarding than the traditional CFO role. Are there any practical takeaways to support us being succinct and to distill our message? I'm going to steal this one quickly. There's one thing that I saw recently, and I was talking about it just yesterday in the office. I've been on leave for the last 2 weeks in New Zealand. My father-in-law has a 1951 Land Rover, and I took a photo of the dashboard, and there is a purpose behind this story. So I took a photo of the dashboard there. Now, a 1951 Land Rover has 3 dials on it that you need to be able to drive this truck. It has the speed, it actually has the battery power, and it has the fuel tank. Then it has a couple of lights for engine temperature, etc. But effectively, if I want to distill my messages down, and the purpose behind this is, if we think about dashboards nowadays, we love to invent dashboards, and the amount of dashboards out there are becoming ludicrous and huge. But we've actually forgotten the art that we're talking about, the key metrics that we're looking at. So this is distilling communication and information. When I think back to that 1951 Land Rover, if you have 3 things you need to drive that truck, that's all you need to know. You need to know the speed, you need to know how much fuel you've got, and in this one it was actually the battery power. So effectively distilling the information down to exactly what people need. I know that, Sue, you've also had some practical takeaways we talked about in terms of even more practical than my little frolic there, but in terms of even just presence as well.
Yeah, but actually, Nick, even before I go to that, because that absolutely is something as well to think about. I think Andrew touched on it as well, with the use of graphs and visuals and charts and things can be so helpful. But before you even identify what's going to be on there, it's have you got across the business and spoken to people, and do you really understand what the key levers are for the business? Exactly to that dashboard in that truck in New Zealand, what are the key levers that are going to make the change and keep us moving in the direction that we have decided we're going in from a strategic perspective? And one of the models actually that you can use to help you with that is just what, so what, and what now, in terms of distilling information. What happened, so what, what's the impact, what do we care, and now what are we going to do? So I think that can be a great little model to just focus our minds. But it's back to as well understanding the business. What are the key levers? I might come back to the present space because I feel that Andrew probably has something to offer as well around being succinct and distilling messages.
Yeah, I fully agree, but I think the starting point often for me is, okay, what is the business strategy? And from that business strategy, and to reiterate what Nick and Sue have articulated is, okay, what are the 2 or 3 most meaningful metrics that we really need to, that are reflecting, and this is an important piece, that they reflect value delivering behaviours. So we're not necessarily looking at lagging measures. We're looking at behaviours that in the future will be delivering value, and ideally as quickly as possible. And that to me is amongst the most meaningful thing to do, and it's very useful in, say, the sales and marketing environment. There's a lot you can do there. There's a lot you can do with integrating CRMs and social media and machine learning, and in terms of creating the feedback loop of, okay, I'm not just interested in generating the sales team lots of leads, I'm also interested in ensuring that those leads are more profitable and including those feedback. And so to Sue's point, it's really important to be going out to the team leaders and thinking about, well, what are those two or three metrics within your team that really matter and really influence the positive value creating behaviours? And that behaviours piece, so often revenue is an interesting one. We used to have a Wednesday morning meeting where we looked at, okay, if it's a professional service team, we're looking at the live WIT, what's in the timesheets. So great, excellent. Yep, we have this 15-minute meeting. We have that every week. Nothing ever happened of it. And it'd be much more meaningful of, okay, well, what's happening in our pipeline? How many meetings are people having with people from their LinkedIn network, or how many people are doing something like this and engaging with a wider network? Because that's actually a more meaningful value-adding enterprise, rather than just saying, okay, well, look in the rearview mirror, okay, what's the revenue likely to be this month? What we want is to influence people's behaviour, which I think is another point of the CVO, is about thinking about positive behaviours. And that comes from the top and permeates all the way through the organisation. And influencing behaviours is a really interesting way to look at the new role of a CVO.
I love that distinction, Andrew. The shift from the lagging indicators and the leading indicators, in the sense of what actually is going to change next week's results. And that's not necessarily the sales we did last week. So I think that distinction is really important. And this piece about influencing positive behaviours, that is, in a nutshell, really, isn't it? That's what we as leaders need to be doing.
One of our clients is actually an expert in change management, in business transformation. And they often talk about change management, looking at through maybe 1 or 2 metrics at a time. Okay, for the next 3 months, this is, and they'll kind of take a campaign mentality. These are the 2 or 3 metrics and behaviours that we're going to focus on for this next period, and they just hammer away at that, and from a number of different perspectives, just make progress and move the needle on that particular issue. And then it's about, okay, where do we go from there? And eventually, it's not straightforward, and that change management piece is really like turning the Titanic. You need to be patient, but it can take up to 18 months to really start to see cultural and behavioural changes in an organisation.
And I really like that from what you were talking about, Andrew, and it ties back in with what Sue said as well. You were looking at revenue on a Wednesday, so what? What was the point?
I went back through all of the meetings. There was not one single outcome. There was not one single to-do item that came out of those meetings, and I thought, what on earth have I been doing? It was a real epiphany for me, and so I kind of took it out of the diary, and we don't do it anymore. We do look at, okay, what are the behaviours that are going to affect next month's P&L or the months after, it's a much more meaningful conversation that we're having.
And I think that's really useful in terms of, and those questions are precise as well. I think that question of so what is so important, and I think that's really how you end up distilling your message. And this is where we, as you said, we can communicate, we can talk to other people within the organisation, and you can say what is the dashboard, if we're creating dashboards for someone or people in the organisation through a business partnering, what is important to you in your part of this business? What are the metrics that matter to you? So I can have a dashboard that has everyone's metrics on it, but that actually creates noise, in my view. If we can serve up, and Power BI completely can do this. I can create a dashboard for Sue, I can create a dashboard for Andrew, I can create a dashboard for me. And we can just distill it up, allow people to drill in, they can go get the underlying data. But to that point, I've been in board meetings where board members of an SME were sitting around talking about how much jam they bought for the kitchen. And if you look down the P&L and you go, and if we're doing a line-by-line review, their biggest cost was in staffing, then rent. You know, jam in the kitchen was not even material. We weren't even talking about anything, and so they were missing the point. So as the CFO, the job there is to say, we're missing the point here. If you want to move the dial, changing what jam we buy is not going to change the profitability of this company. And in fact, from a communication perspective, and you both might agree with me or disagree with me here, changing the jam could be detrimental because that's communicating to the people that you don't value them as much potentially.
Absolutely. I feel like I've sat in some of those same board meetings as well, Nick. Sometimes, you know, board members and C-suite leaders can be drowning in information.
Yeah.
And so sometimes their attention will alight on something for some reason that calls to them. But yeah, it's our role as a chief value officer to bring them back to, well, how are we going to create value? And you're absolutely right. When we start tinkering with the biscuits and the jam in the kitchen, that actually starts to worry people, because oh gosh, if the extra few dollars over here is going to make a difference, maybe there's something really wrong in this organization, and or maybe I just don't like the one you've bought in, you know, and that just gets me offside. So you're right. We need to be really particular about focusing our attention and our direction on the key levers, these key value drivers, and how are we going to ensure that that's where the conversation is.
Absolutely. I think we've just got about 10 minutes left, so I thought we'd go back to, we talked a bit and touched upon the relationship between the CEO and the CFO. And I think that's a really crucial piece of communication. I've seen organizations where those two didn't get along, and effectively the advice as an external provider was to say one of you has to go, because the organization will not flourish. Disagreement is fine, but you know, the way that they couldn't stand each other was being detrimental to the organization in at such a level. So with this relationship and this communication level at that CEO, CFO level, Sue, how do you think, as a CFO, I always say you can control what you can control, so I can't control the CEO if I'm the CFO. How do I approach my communication with them?
Look, I loved the expression that was in the report about being the sparring partner, because I think that is where a good CEO, CFO relationship plays. Exactly as you said, it's not about agreeing all the time. So one of my clients did say, oh, I really want to be in alignment with my CEO. And I said, yeah, in alignment on a strategic level, and in terms of the purpose of we're working together in this organization, to a shared purpose, that's absolutely important, that we're aligned in those big picture ways. But we need people who are going to challenge a CEO. And I think that the CFO has to have the confidence in what they bring, and also the humility to be able to see that they don't have all the answers, so that they can have really lively debate and discussion with that CEO. So I think sometimes what I have seen in some clients, you see the opposite extremes. Some have been CFOs who have perhaps, sometimes especially if they've been promoted within the same organization, and they say to me, the C-suite or the CEO in particular are still seeing me as the young junior accountant. They're not, and exactly to your point, well, I can't control how the CEO sees you. What you can control is, how do you show up? How do you bring more presence? How do you demonstrate your leadership? By, as we've talked about, distilling the message, focusing on what's really important. How do you build more confidence? And this is where I work with people as well, about confidence around your breath, your posture, your voice, in terms of how you present not only to the CEO, but to the board, for example, so that you're building that credibility at that more senior level. And confidence comes from the inside, and you can do all the reflective work, and then you have to do the hard stuff, and you'll get better at it. It will get easier. The first time you challenge the CEO will be hard if you haven't done it before. But it's back to how do you prepare for that conversation? How do you ensure that you are coming with the clarity around what your expectation or outcomes are, but also a willingness to listen, to understand, to see different perspectives, and then understand, that you might have to go along with the decision the CEO makes. And as long as you've both agreed that it is still in alignment with the strategy of the organization, that's how it's going to be. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I have seen, I've worked with CFOs who are so insistent that they know the right answer, that is also what's getting the CEO, out of alignment with them, because they're saying, I need him to listen to me. I need this to be a two-way conversation, rather than back to that piece about me just presenting information and data and saying, this is the only way it is. And I think it comes with maturity. It comes with seeing new perspectives. Answers are rarely black and white. And that comes with maturity, the ability to see multiple perspectives, hold multiple conflicting perspectives simultaneously, and have that constructive conflict within the C-suite more generally as well. So those are just a few thoughts on how that can play out.
That's great.
Very interesting to hear some leadership consistency coming through this. That need for self-awareness, the need to avoid having a fragile ego, and to be able to take constructive criticism. I think there's also a need for empathy and mapping away, thinking about how either your CEO or other C-suite members are going to receive a piece of information. If you are seeking to influence, what's the best way here? How can I transit these choppy waters? The way I see the relationship with my chief value officer is we're kind of partners in crime, and for her, because I'm kind of the conduit between the executive and the organisation and the board. So I'm constantly changing gears between a strategic mindset and then a very tactical one. And my chief value officer is really helps me with the clarity to change those gears and think about how do I communicate to very different stakeholders with very different mindsets, one with a helicopter view, one with an execution view. And I think that necessary tension that Sue mentions about willingness to challenge each other, to do so with empathy, but do so without any fragility of ego, super important. And I think that is a really good attribute of any leader, of that they leave their ego at the door and are really thinking about, well, Also goes to hiring, is that generally I'm hiring people who are better at stuff than I am. And they're bringing value because it's not a skill set or an expertise I necessarily have. I'm not just in this role because I'm the one with the bandwidth to do it. It's also I'm in this role because I appreciate I'm able to bring different people from around the organisation to fill the gaps that I possibly don't have. And my CVO, wow, big gap for me. Lots of learning curve. They're constantly educating me, and it's that partner in crime. If that relationship is dysfunctional, wow, it's a real problem. And to Sue's point, I have seen, and yours, Nick, I've seen very dysfunctional organisation where that's actually the core problem, the relationship between those two people.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, and it's good to hear the lived experience as well. I wanted to add there that Sue made a really good point as well, that I've been given throughout my career in a lot of respects. Is there's also a lot to talk about. We could go on about this for a while, but I'm aware that we're going to wrap up soon. But posture and even feeling confident can make you, or acting confident, standing up tall. I started doing Pilates and it gets me standing taller, straight back. And as soon as you feel like that, you actually walk in with an air of confidence, and that helps you to present a point. It's also, from my perspective, is understanding what, and I hate the sort of battle language, but what hills are you willing to die on in these conversations? Is this something that's so important to the organisation that you really need to get it across, or is it kind of something that it's your pet project, and if it doesn't go ahead, it's not going to be detrimental? Or are we walking into an insolvency event, for instance, and therefore you need to get that message across to everyone and really, really be succinct and clear about that message? So I think that it's having the confidence behind that as well, and understanding to those points what we're actually willing to give up on versus what we're not willing to give up on. And I think that cultural alignment as well that Sue talked about is so critical. If we're all aligned ultimately, yes, I may have a difference of opinion, but as long as that's still going in the same direction, we're all going to be very happy. Now, we're at time, so I think I might quickly throw to both of you to quickly give your final thoughts, but also where we can find you as well. So Sue, would you?
So my final thoughts are that the CFO is, in many organisations, already effectively playing this role of Chief Value Officer. And I think actually to one of our attendees this morning who said they were fully aligned and they think it's more rewarding, I would suggest to a lot of CFOs out there, they are seeing this as, the next step in a sense, no matter what we call it, no matter what the title is. It is, how can I be more involved at a higher strategic level? How do I lift myself out of the detail? How do I partner more with the CEO and really stretch myself? Because that's, and this is going to be sometimes, which we haven't said today, sometimes this is going to be very uncomfortable, because when we're stretching beyond our comfort zone, it's hard. And for me, the key there is to get the support of either within your organisation or outside of your organisation, is to really seek support and not be afraid to ask for help in terms of the areas where you feel you're challenged. And how people can find me is, I'm pretty easily found on LinkedIn. I'm on there a lot, so Sue Rosen, or sue@suerosen.com.au is my email address.
Perfect, thank you. Andrew, closing thoughts?
Look, it's been an enthralling conversation, and thank you both, Nick and Sue. It's really interesting to dig into the weeds here, but I think at its core is actually, at the core of Sue's challenge of building leaders, and that's the challenge for the CVO, is about, okay, do you seize that opportunity to shift from a more tactical role to a more strategic one, to be thinking about distilling complexity into its simplest, most purest form. How can I influence behaviour? How can I influence change? One of the things I just bang on about here at Wilkinson Butler is around thinking about how do individual people think about agency, and how can they, in their role, whether it's with clients or within our firm itself, how can they affect change? And the CVO is a really big opportunity for everyone out there in these existing roles to really think about how do I affect change? How do I actually be at the meaningful edge of these things? And there's lots of opportunities to not just affect organisations, but the stakeholders beyond environment, lots to do in ESG and so forth. So it's a really rich environment in terms of how can you can change the world for better. So it's a really exciting challenge to lay down. I really take my hat off to BDO for laying down the challenge. And to catch me, it's at www.wilkinsonbutler.com.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, and I do appreciate everyone's attendance today. And thank you very much to the panelists. I'd like to wrap this up today. So thank you again, and talk next time. Thank you.
Delighted.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Sue. Thank you, Nick. Cheers.